Hi everyone. Whoa. Always weird to hear yourself talking. Today I want to talk to you and share with you some of my adventures working with REST APIs and JSON using PowerShell. Let's turn this on. But first of all, let's thank the sponsors for making this day happen. And even more important, thank the organization for making this day happen, because it's really cool. And this is just to annoy Rob that I'm making a lot of noise in my room. I told him I would tease him a bit. So, for those of you who have no clue who I am, a short introduction. My name is Ester Barthel. Been working as a technical consultant for some years now. And I very recently started my own company. So now I can call myself anything, right? I decided to stick to the truth and call myself solution architect. But basically what I've been doing for most of my years is work with Citrix implementation and designs. So that's basically my background. That also helped me with all the community work that I'm doing to get awarded by Citrix as a Citrix technology professional, and even more recently by Microsoft as an MVP. So really doing well for myself. But if we are talking about PowerShell, for the last 5 years, I've been diving into the DevOps scripting fun. And I have to say, I started very intimate with Windows Server deployment, trying to figure out PowerShell and all the cool stuff you can do with it, and slowly worked to extending that to even Citrix deployments, and more recently, automating NetScaler configurations. And I'm not sure if any of you know what a Citrix NetScaler is. Good. All you need to know is that, well, even though I am using it in this demo today to show how PowerShell and REST API calls are made, so you can see some of the results, and I have some cool demos to share with you. It's not really important for all the PowerShell stuff that we're going to do. So it's to quickly describe it, a Citrix NetScaler is like an application delivery controller, which basically enables people to use it in network environments from OC layer 2 till OC layer 7. So basically I can do routing with it, and I can even do application firewalls settings. For the demos, I'll mostly use it as a load balancer to just load balance a web service. Basically already sharing some of my intent with this presentation. I figured to make sure that we all know what we're talking about, at least if I'm talking about REST APIs, is to give you an introduction, to also give a short introduction on JSON, JavaScript object notation, which is usually used in combination with REST API calls. As I mentioned, I'm using a NetScaler just to show you and to walk you through building my first REST API script with PowerShell, and I have some demos. And if time permits, but knowing me, I'll probably just have too much fun with the demos. If time permits, I'll also share some extra tips and tricks from my experiences. So let's start with REST APIs and NITRO. REST APIs are based on a client-server architecture. And this ensures that basically we can have a stateless and platform-independent protocol to communicate between the client and the server. And what I especially like about it is that it's really based on standards, as it's using the HTTP protocol. And I'll explain some of that later on. Using the HTTP protocol makes it more easy to use REST API calls, even in more secured environments that have firewalls in place. Because I don't know about you guys, but I usually have a less tough time getting a port 80 or a port 443 to a service opened by the firewall guys than some exotic port that they have no idea what will happen next. And as I mentioned NITRO on the previous slide, if I'm using NITRO as a word in this presentation, it's because that's the name Citrix gave to the REST API service on a NetScaler. So I should just say REST API, but I'll probably use NITRO a couple of times because I got so used to it. And it's just the same as a regular REST service. So it has the client-server architecture, and it allows me to make HTTP-based communications with the NetScaler. So just a couple of slides, or just one slide to explain some of the setup in my demo. So what I'm having is I have a virtual NetScaler appliance running on my machine, and I'm using a Windows desktop to launch my PowerShell scripts. And I need to have some things in place. As I mentioned, it's a client-server architecture. So the server part is my NetScaler running the REST service. The client part can be a standalone REST client, like the CURL, or Postman, which is add-on plugin for Google Chrome, and gives you a nice GUI to actually immediately test the syntax of your REST API call or the syntax of your JSON formatting. But today is a PowerShell day, so I'm going to use a programming language. And luckily for me, I can download different SDKs from my NetScaler to interact with NITRO, so to speak. Unfortunately, there's no PowerShell SDK. So I'm going to use PowerShell to make native REST API calls. The main thing to have and to take into account is that REST API and making REST API calls is not like PowerShell and has get help. So in order to know how to construct your JSON payload and which parameters you can use or which information you can send to your REST API call, make sure that you find the documentation. For the NetScaler, I can download the API reference guide, which gives me very detailed information. Just to run over some things, if I want to enable some features on my NetScaler appliance, I simply go to the resource configuration and then select the resource type NS feature, and it gives me detailed information of the operations that I can perform, and even per operation what syntax to use. And I'll get back to this in a couple of slides. As mentioned at the beginning, REST API calls are based on HTTP protocol. And if we want to make an HTTP call, we need to provide quite some information. We need to provide a verb, letting the server know which HTTP method we are using. We need to specify URI, because the server needs to know which resource we want to address, maybe even what kind of operation we want to perform on our resource, and a request header that contains some metadata, usually about data syntax, data formatting, because the request body contains our actual data and information we are sending to the server. Translating that to NITRO or a REST API call, so now looking at the NetScaler configurations, I have to provide an HTTP method as well. I can use get to retrieve existing information from my NetScaler. I can use post to send new information or new configuration to my NetScaler. I can use put to manipulate or change existing information, or delete to delete existing information. So those are the basic HTTP methods.
Can I just have a question? You talked about
Yep.
stateless. So with the concept of put, there's nothing like I can have another call. I've got to do it all in one call. Is that what we mean by stateless?
Yes. So it's just that one call performs an action. It's not that you can retrieve information, dynamically change it and push it back. It's just a new call. So yes, that makes it a bit limited or a bit REST API call intensive, so to speak, communication intensive. Yes. Correct. So the HTTP method is just the first part of information I need to provide to make a REST API call. I also need to provide the URI, or in this case the URL, which always starts with HTTP or HTTPS if I want to have a secure connection to my server. In this case, the NetScaler IP address to actually talk to the REST service on the NetScaler, /nitro/v1. That's the base line of the URL. And then with the NetScaler, I have two different options. I can either use /config to let the service know that I want to do something with the NetScaler configuration, or /stat to retrieve statistical information from my NetScaler. For the demo purposes, I just focused on the configuration. But that's not all, because I also need to let the service know which resource type I want to address. And as I mentioned previously, I would like to do something with the NetScaler features in my demo. And even more specific, I want to enable them. So I also need to specify an action with the URL. So the service knows how to interpret the action or the operation that I want to perform. So now I have two parts down, the method and the URL. There's more information that I need to provide. I also need to provide the request header. And even more specific, I need to specify the content type for the request body, because the service needs to know how to interpret the information that I'm sending out. Am I doing XML or something else? Well, with the REST API call, JSON is basically becoming the standard formatting for the information that you exchange. And in the beginning, we had to specify for each resource type that we were addressing what content type to use. Luckily for us, Citrix realized that that was a bit intensive and too specific for each resource type to use. So they decided to have a generic content type, application/JSON, which makes it really easy because now it's becoming a constant for my script. Last but not least, the request body. And as I'm specifying in my request header that the formatting will be JSON, I need to include some JSON formatted information in my body. So let's zoom in on that. First of all, this is just a quick summary, and I'll return to this slide a couple of times just to make sure that we all have all the information for the demo. But this is all the information I need to make a REST API call. So time to get started, right? Time to build my first script. So as I mentioned, there's no SDK for PowerShell with the NetScaler, so I needed to use the Invoke-RestMethod that is included as a commandlet in PowerShell. And as I'm using a JSON payload, I also need to do something with that. So I'm very happy that my Invoke-RestMethod basically enables me to send out all the information that I gathered for my REST API call with just one single line of code. And there are two variations to it. The first line enables me to create a session variable, the same with the invoke web request. I can specify a session variable that has all my session information, so I can build a session to the service, and then send multiple REST API calls by referring to that session variable in thank you. I can't even repeat that. In all the REST API calls I want to make after that. So as I mentioned, this is the information that I need for the Invoke-RestMethod. And then there's still the body, the JSON. So I need a way to easily create a JSON payload. With JSON, there's some slight syntax differences between JSON and PowerShell for looking at arrays, but also for hash tables. And the good news is that PowerShell offers the ConvertTo-Json commandlet. Woohoo! So this basically allows me to very easily build my hash table and arrays with PowerShell, then use the ConvertTo-Json commandlet to change it. So I can quickly just build the JSON formatting and then something happens. Because, well, maybe not everyone knows. Some will know who just went to Jonathan's session. But by default, the ConvertTo-Json function only has 2 levels depth. So that's the default value for the depth parameter that you can use with the ConvertTo-Json. So in order to make sure that that 3rd level of information is included in my JSON formatting, I have to specify a depth that's 3 or higher. In this case, using 5 as a very safe value. So let's get back to building that script. How to translate this information into PowerShell. If I log on to the management console of my NetScaler, it's very easy. I just select a couple of boxes for the features, click OK, and I'm done. But for PowerShell, I'm going to use the REST APIs. Questions already, or?
Session variables, you want to put authentication cookies in there before?
The session variable contains the cookie. And the cookie is returned with the first call I'm going to make. And I'm going to run you through the script. So we're going to run through it step by step.
Tend to use default credentials for that, like here.
Yeah, well, I was hoping that it would show something, but hang on. So basically, this is the logon screen for my NetScaler. So this is the management console. Using default credentials. There are a lot of features that I can configure on my NetScaler, but if we are talking about those, enabling those features, I can go to the settings and configure some basic features. So I just need to select those boxes, but this is to let you know that I'm starting with a clean NetScaler configuration. So let me just...
Presumably you can license it through the REST API as well, because a lot of the features won't turn on unless they're licensed.
True, yes. I didn't include it in a demo because it means you need to upload the license file and things like that, but I have some scripts that do that. So I hope this is still readable for the people in the back, or do I need to? All good? Or do you want to have it enlarged a bit? So let's see if we can. Is this better? Cool. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm just using some variables, which is the NetScaler IP address, to make that session, and I need to provide some credentials when I create my first session. Going to the API reference guide, there is a getting started guide with that. And that basically tells me how to connect or make that first REST API call to my NetScaler appliance. And if we go through the documentation, it kind of specifies all the information I need to make that REST API call. So it specifies the HTTP method that I need to use, post in this case, the URL that I need to use if I change the IP address because I'm using a different IP address, the content type, which is still that old formatting. We're going to use application/JSON. And even more important, the request payload that I need to send out with my Invoke-RestMethod. So going back to my script, I kind of copied all that information so I could easily create my first call. Hang on, let me just first run the variables to make sure that I have everything in place. As I mentioned, I'll need to provide the URL. So that's /config/logon because I want to log on to my NetScaler and start my session. So I'm going to run that. And then I need to create that JSON payload using the ConvertTo-Json function, specifying a depth of 5 just to be sure, with the logon information, username, and in this case I'm using the variable, and the password. So just making sure that I'm having the right information for my JSON payload, I can now use the Invoke-RestMethod, specifying the method, specifying the URL, specifying the request body, which is the JSON payload, the content type, and I'm using the session variable parameter to specify that NetScaler session will be the variable that contains my session information. And verbose is just to make sure that we get at least some response. So making that first call, I now have created a session. And just to make sure, you'll notice that the response that is returned does contain an error code, which is 0, meaning everything went well. And it also has a session ID in there, which is the cookie session ID information that I need to provide with the next Invoke-RestMethod or the next REST API call that I make. So zooming in on the session ID. But I also told you that we specified the NetScaler session variable. So just to make sure I can use that variable, let's check the amount of cookies in the variable, which is 1. So I have some information in a cookie in my session, and if all goes well, that should be the same information as the session ID I got from the response. So, and it's a very long string to compare, so using PowerShell just to make sure. So both have the same session information. So I'm good to go because now I have the variable that I can refer to in my next Invoke-RestMethod that has my web session information. But as I mentioned, I want to do something with those NetScaler features. So let's just start with getting the information configuration from the NetScaler on the current feature set. So once again, looking at the data, I need to perform a get method, HTTP method. And I need to specify a URL. In this case, I'm doing /config/ns-feature because that's what the information or the API reference specified. And with a get method, I don't need to specify any request body information because I want to retrieve information from my NetScaler. So specifying the URI once more, I now have all the information, including the web session that I'm sending with it as well, containing my session information, to make that call. And unfortunately, it doesn't give me a lot of information like, okay, we got something, or specific. But you need to know if you check the response where to look. Sorry, this response does contain some information because it has the error code and the basic settings. And it has an object or that's called NSFeature, so we can check that out. So looking at the features, it's quite a list because there are a lot of features to enable on a NetScaler. If I slowly scroll through it, you'll see that everything is still set to false. As we saw in the GUI, in the management console, that I had no feature selected. So I guess it's time to now really start interacting with my NetScaler. So to enable some NetScaler features, I once again need to specify a URL, an HTTP method, and the features that I want to enable in the JSON payload to make that REST API call, or use the Invoke-RestMethod to do that. So it's becoming kind of like a mantra. Create the URL, create the payload. Oh, hang on. Making sure that we can see and check for debugging reasons. So now I have my payload as well, and I'm specifying some of the features. In this case, I'm enabling load balancing, SSL functionality, the gateway functionality on the NetScaler, and some other cool stuff. Making the Invoke-RestMethod. And oh, what I meant is that this time, when you do a post or a put, you don't get like much confirmation. So the response is empty. It's not containing a lot of information. So that's what I meant with it's stateless. So now you have to do a get again to ensure, or I could check in the management console to see if something happened. So I'm not getting a very good response, in my opinion, when I make a REST API call.
In your code, you have something about a 200, 400, and 500.
Yes, that's what it specifies. The 200 should be in the code. That's what I expected to be in the response.
You have to use the Invoke web request handler, I guess.
Then I'm going to be able to read that.
That's the reason I stopped using the Invoke-RestMethod and actually started using the generic web request.
And
Always get something.
building the entire web request. So the Invoke web request will return that information. But the Invoke-RestMethod doesn't really return that in the object that it's.
It's not good when you want to troubleshoot if you actually
True.
things you want it to be.
Yeah, that's some of the limitation that I'm running into, that with a lot of scripts I'm find myself pushing configuration to the NetScaler in this case, and then immediately doing a get command to check, to have some visual confirmation, which makes it kind of cumbersome to do all that scripting. But as I said, we could do a get just to make sure that we get an overview and check if the features were enabled.
At that point, it might be more cumbersome than the check, but it's less cumbersome than having to convert everything into JSON, to do all the extra scaffolding to convert the response back from Invoke web request into something meaningful and parse it all through and go through the body and find out what it is.
Yeah, because, well, the good news is if I run into errors, then I will get the errors back from the Invoke-RestMethod. So I could rely on, if everything is cool and there are no errors, then probably everything went okay. but for me that just doesn't feel right. I still want some visual confirmation, so that's why I'm using a lot of get methods to double check the information or the changes.
So you're saying if it fails, you get the 400 and 500, but if it succeeds, you don't get the 200?
True. Yes.
Plus also you presumably store the features before in a variable and then compare them with results after.
Oh, I selected too much. I was wondering why I got an error. Sorry, there was a question. You sure? I got distracted by red lines of code, sorry. So basically, this is just to give you a quick overview of how you can use Invoke-RestMethod to push configurations and check by retrieving configurations. And because I don't like to leave sessions lingering or waiting for sessions to get through the timeout and be closed on the server side, there's also a nice command. Just simply send JSON payload that has logout in it to log off your web session. So that enables you to have some control of the communication that you have between the client and the server side. So basically, as you saw, it does take a lot of lines of code to build all the JSON payloads, to get the URL right, to get the methods right. So I was looking for a way to ease my life and to get back to kind of one lines of code. I found a blog on the Citrix website, and they offered a PowerShell module. Basically having functions that would do all the converting, all the JSON payload building for me. So I got really excited about that, dived right into the module to realize that all the module did was use the post method. So I could only send new configurations to my NetScaler for a subset of the functions that, or the features and the configurations that I could do. So it was a nice start, but it wasn't all that I wanted to use it for. So as I have tons of time to spare, I decided to add some more functions to it, making sure that I have like a full administrative module for my NetScaler in this case. And I'm building and building and building on forward to it. Starting out, as Citrix did, with just one gigantic module file, which isn't very easy if you put it on GitHub to make sure that you can easily change some of the configuration. So a big shout out to Chrissy Lemaire, who showed me a template on building the right or using the right set of files for a PowerShell module. No, I just used copy and paste to create a lot of files. Woohoo, die hard. Private and public folders, yes. So there is a function in there that kind of does the Invoke-RestMethod and creates the JSON. So that became a private function, and all the functions that do enable feature, for instance, became public functions. So I'm very proud of that. So basically, what happened is all this information that was, well, in my case, 170 plus lines of code with all the extra cut and pasting information, could easily be turned into just a couple of lines of code with the module. Importing the module, using the enable NS feature function by just specifying my list of features, and boom, done. Pretty cool, right? Because having all those functions enables me if we're talking about a NetScaler, and you're probably not as excited as I am, but it enables me to use this kind of transform, this kind of configuration, and I'll explain some of it. This is my graphical representation of a NetScaler configuration. In the blue boxes, from left to right, I'm specifying a virtual server for load balancing, which is linked to a service group, whatever, but that group contains of two members, two servers that I'm load balancing my requests to, and they have an IP address. Pretty simple, right? So what's with all the other information on there? Well, I thought it would be easier for my users if they could just type in the URL in the browser and not have to worry about the fact that I want them to connect on a HTTP with SSL or HTTPS. So if you type the URL in your browser, it automatically assumes you want to make an HTTP call. So on the NetScaler, I can do something really cool, which is HTTP to HTTPS redirection. So basically, I'm building a second virtual server for that, doing some magic with it, and adding something that we call a responder policy that basically tells the browser this page is moved, which with a 301 HTTP response, ensuring that the browser now goes to HTTPS. And then there's some monitoring to make sure that I'm actively only sending client requests to healthy servers in the backend, and some certificates.
When you're scripting the configuration, do you have to respect the binding order like you do in the GUI? It goes, oh, you can't do this
Yeah.
because you haven't bound blah, 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 or you can't check
Yeah,
it's bound. Yeah.
True. Some orders have to be in place. So basically, even though I'm explaining it from left to right, I'm building the configuration from right to left. So just to make it easy. Yeah, what you can do is you can create the individual, but you cannot, as you say, the binding, so the linkings between them, you have to do that. The objects have to be there before you can do that. So,
Because the GUI is calling the same underlying stuff anyway. The GUI is just a way of calling the NetScaler and telling it to do stuff. And you just
yeah, the GUI actually uses REST API calls to the NetScaler, so, but they're doing it in some weird ways. It's not always as intuitive as I would like it to be. Basically, by using the functions in the module, I can limit this to, say, a couple of lines of code to create everything in that configuration. So that's doable, right? So let me just go back to the demo environment. Just because I think it's fun, but I hope you'll enjoy it as well. So I'll probably have to log on again. So as you were saying, it might just kick me out, but my session is still. If I want to do this configuration through the management console, I need to specify servers. Then I have to go to service groups, I have to go to the virtual servers and do all kinds of configurations, which is a lot of manual actions and a lot of ways to have human error in there. So as I shown with the module, which I think I'm importing in the first part of the script, and using HTTPS, I can simply use all the functions in my module to have like one line of code to do all that configuration. So if I just run this script, that was the first part, doing all the rewrites and responder actions. And this is the part configuring all the load balancing that I need. So that's just like, okay, it took me maybe a couple of hours to write it all down. But running a script like that, by having a kind of template, I'm just left to like less than a couple of minutes of time. And going back to the management interface, you'll now notice that all the information is configured on the NetScaler. So, pretty cool, right? No, hang on. It gets even better. There's a finale to it.
I know, but if you don't appreciate NetScaler, you won't appreciate what you've just done.
True, I guess so. But
There was no swearing, no getback.
no, but I know my first experience with a NetScaler was just logging on and looking at the left menu, and then I just wanted to cry in a corner and had no idea where to start because it's very overwhelming with all the features. And this is just a basic example. But what I kind of wanted to show, that if I now enter the URL, and I have to do it, oh, hang on, and not specify HTTPS or anything else, if I press enter, the NetScaler is now configured, thank you, to redirect me to HTTPS. And in this example, I'm using storefront configuration, which is a Citrix web service. Citrix wants you to specify /Citrix/name of the store. So I made it easier for users by adding that through the NetScaler configuration. And if I hit refresh, you'll notice that there are two servers, which I had a green and a blue server. I didn't want to try a red server, but that's because there's no default red theme for storefront. So basically that's just it. But it is load balancing my user sessions between the two servers. So basically, with just a couple of lines of code, I'm now more in control and easier capable of configuring my NetScaler or some NetScaler features. So I hope this gave you some impression of using REST API calls, making REST API calls, of using JSON payloads. I can show you a lot more, but I think I'm down to 3 minutes now after the signal I got.
How confident would you be to put a reset complete at the beginning of your script and just rebuild the NetScaler config every time you wanted to move on or test something new?
Well, basically what I'm doing with a NetScaler, you need to save the configuration to go from the running config to the save. Thank you. I was blank. To the saved config, which is loaded when the NetScaler boots. So with my demo device, I just reboot the NetScaler, have a clean start, and then run the script again. And I have some additional scripts for gateway configurations and all kinds of other cool stuff.
Are you aware of Carl Webster's script for gathering Citrix farm information?
Yes.
I was thinking this could bolt onto that and get a complete.
Yeah, well, one of my CTP colleagues, Barry Schiffer, created a NetScaler documentation script, which is downloadable from Carl Webster's site. So they teamed up. So, and at first he just imported the nsconfig file and interpreted that, and he now changed, with the help of Ian Brighton, to NITRO and retrieving the configuration that way. So for those of you that would like to use the NetScaler module, I made a repository on GitHub. Woohoo! Still figuring out how that all works, so I'll probably have to ask Chrissy again. But you can download all the scripts, and I'll make sure that I have an add a branch for PSD UK after this session, and then upload the demo scripts there as well. any more questions right now?
If you're using run spaces and then using Invoke-RestMethod, like with session, do you know if it confuses things? Like if you're running things, multi-threading requests?
Oh, I haven't tried that yet.
Obviously, in the case of the NetScaler, you're probably not wanting to do that much stuff all at one time, but it's just a generic.
Yeah, but then I would.
API question.
Yeah, but then I would, if I want to use like multi-threading, then I would have to make sure that I build a different session for each thread that I'm running, just to make sure that they are not interfering within the same.
Something like a web service, if you're coming, like if two requests happen at exactly the same time, it's going to really.
Yeah, but I could run multiple sessions to my NetScaler with the credentials, and then within that session, push the REST API calls, the information or the configuration to the NetScaler. I just have to make sure that they are not intertwined, so to speak.
Yeah.
So they're not conflicting, sending out conflicting configurations.
Could you show what the Win SCP wrapper looks like? For just
Yeah, sure, sure. Let me just quickly, hang on. This was just to say that with HTTPS, I discovered that you could run into errors, and that's basically because the NetScaler uses a self-signed certificate out of the box. So I ran into some problems, and I found a blog on Microsoft on how to kill like the certificate check within my session. So that was the first information, and of course, putting it back into the original configuration after that. File upload. The reason why I mentioned Win SCP wrapper is because NITRO only allows me to upload files up to 2 MBs. So that's kind of limited, and I need to include the file content as base 64 coded in my JSON payload. So that's a lot. So what I figured out with the Win SCP wrapper, I could just easily create the credential and just make a connection using SCP to the NetScaler and simply upload a file by using the path and the protocol. And in case you want to know how I used it, I blogged about it. Woohoo! So, time out. No, time's up. So thank you very much for listening. Cool.